read here, and then I look forward to engaging in a conversation with my friend John Leland. And although he's far too humble and would probably undoubtedly take exception to what I'm about to say, for my money, there's no book that's ever been written that is as good as John Leland's Why Jack Kerouac, or Why Kerouac Matters, and I strongly recommend to you, any of you who haven't read it. So it's just a joy to be here with John tonight, and thank you, John, for coming. And again, thank you to Allen Ginsberg for that 1959 reading of that incredible poem, Howl. Before we engage in some dialogue, I'd like to just read the note to the reader, which is at the beginning of Mania. Again, a book that I did with my co-author, David Skover, who is right now in Seattle, and will be speaking at another fine independent bookstore, Elliott Bay Books. And I wore this hat this evening from City Lights Bookstore, which is where it all began with the publication of Howl, a City Lights publication. Whatever you do, bookstores like this remain open when you buy books. So support the First Amendment, support freedom of expression, freedom of press, and whatever you do, support independent bookstores. And it's a delight to be here, and thank you, Jessica, for having me. Okay. By any measure, they were a bizarre band, at once genius and junkie, cerebral and criminal, innocent and malevolent, lovable and lewd, spiritual and cynical. And they were crazy enough to invite all sorts of trouble, including the kind that produced rebel literature and helped to launch a cultural revolution in America. Who were they? How did they live? What did they value? And how did their literature reflect all of that? In attempting to answer these questions, we were less concerned with catchphrases than we were with what first fueled and then fired the artistic, cultural movement launched by Allen Ginsberg, Jack Kerouac, William Burroughs, John Leland Holmes, and others. In their lives and literature, they wove fact into fiction, and then fiction back into fact, the facts of their lives. Any work that does justice to the heroes, heroines, and rogues of this generation of artists must weave their lives and literature together, if only because they did. The furious, defiant lines in Howl, the wonderful scenes in On the Road, the despair in Junkie, the unnerving satire of Naked Lunch, and the thrill of Go simply cannot be divorced from the ways that Allen Ginsberg, Jack Kerouac, Bill Burroughs, Neal Cassady, Lucien Carr, Bill Canastra, and Herbert Huncke, among others, actually lived their lives. To give the reader a truer feeling of their history, we cast our work in narrative form, offering anecdotal slices of their lives from 1944 to 1957, and presented as a montage of vivid snapshots. In that sense, portions of Mania are necessarily impressionistic. Still, these are impressions based on numerous documented sources, 4,027 to be accurate. Still, these impressions, as I said, are based on numerous documented sources. While there are, to be sure, other and more exhaustive ways to tell their story, we find this approach both more natural and contained. Our hope is that you can experience something of the remarkable and risky lives these men and women lived, and to experience it all without being overwhelmed by mountains of data. We seek neither to demonize nor apologize for Ginsberg and his cohorts. While we tell their tales, we do not feel obligated to defend their darker sides. A sobering line by John Leland about this group bears repeating, quote, "They were shaped by suicide, depression, psychosis, institutionalism, addiction, alcoholism, jail, and early death," close quote. Indeed, if their story as we tell it seems at times to be cartoonish or unduly dark, that is because that is how they lived their lives. Not entirely, but quite often. Yes, there was more to the story, and we try to tell that by way of their amazing literary talents. Still, very much like Kerouac, we admire those who yearn for the impossible. We admire those who crave for a life never lived. We admire those who value a reality never recognized, a love never pursued, a faith never finalized, and a world never imagined. Hence, we do not hesitate to fly their flags from time to time, flags of artistic creativity and personal freedom. Or to invoke another metaphor, we echo Douglas Brinkley's manic desire to find the keys to one's life meaning by putting the accelerator through the floorboard. So we are of two minds. Freedom is always risky business. And once one tastes it, it is all too easy to get drunk under its influence. Those drawn to the free-spirited side of the human equation must be mindful of the ruinous potential in the cannibalism of a lifeboat, as Kenneth Rexroth so vividly tagged it. And yet one cannot ignore, and Rexroth could not ignore, the vastness of the creative spirit launched by Ginsberg, Kerouac, Burroughs, Holmes, and their kind. Whatever one makes of their spirit, its DNA traces can be found in everything from the lyrics of Bob Dylan to the music of Jim Morrison, from the vitalizing spirit of the Baltimore folk singer Sonia Rustine, to the theater of Stephen Sondheim, the photography of Annie Leibovitz, the novels of Norman Mailer and Ken Kesey, the short stories of T.C. Boyle, the essays of Susan Sontag, and the journalism of Ned Hentoff, and the free speech jurisprudence of Justice William O. Douglas. If you need more, lend your ears to John Turturro's recitation of Howl, or to Matt Dillon's reading of On the Road, or Dennis Hopper's belting out Burroughs lines. These experiences will, we think, move the matter of your being. Our story culminates in a momentous poem, Allen Ginsberg's Howl. That poem, in turn, is one born and bred in the real-life experiences of young men and women eager to test the limits of life, love, law, language, and every norm of normality. We picture their fast and fantastic stories largely through the filter of the history of Howl and those associated with its author. Howl alone did not, of course, launch a revolution in American culture that produced some of the great creative lights of our time. Still, if one looks through the wide lens of its story, as set out on our pages, there is much to witness. Snapshots of the inexplicable spirit and spontaneity of a group of talented, and yes, troubled, angel-headed hipsters who left an indelible mark on the American soul. This chronicle, Mania, opens with an unforgivable killing. It continues 4 years later with an unusual car crash, and it ends with an unexpected court verdict in a free speech case. In between, the story is even more unbelievable, though all true. It is, to borrow from the historian James Swanson, a story far too incredible to have ever been made up. The wondrous and tragic stories that follow are their stories. The words are their words, and the mania of it all was their reality.
All right, thanks. If you were curious about what Ron's book is about, now you have an idea what it was. I felt like I should be like banging on a cheap bottle of Tokay and yelling, "Go, go, go!" But I don't.
Had I thought of that, I would have brought one for you.
I'm not sure I'm quite suited to that. All right, somebody's telephone.
Just one correction for the record: Ron and David Skover's book.
Okay, I will continually refer to it as Ron's book, but Ron and David Skover's book.
All right.
But thanks, that was terrific. And I love it that you mentioned the Matt Dillon reading of On the Road. You know, I spoke at the thing one time, and I was talking a lot about the sadness of On the Road, how we often think of it as this book about joy, 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 and kicks, kicks, kicks. But at heart, it's a really sad book and a sad tale. And someone came up to me afterwards, and he was a blind person, and he said he had consumed the book through recordings. And the first recording he had was an audio recording for the blind. And he said it was a really sad book. And then he read he listened to the Matt Dillon version, and there was a real joyous go, go, go thing. So it's, it just goes to show that the perspective on these things can change according to the reader and according to the era in which they are. And, so much of our understanding of the beats comes to us, I think, through the filter of the 1960s, where they are the germ that successfully set off this revolution. But of course, that's not how anybody lived their lives. And I think one of the nice things about your book, and David Skover's book, is that you're trying to get at what their lives were like as they were living them in that moment. They didn't really set out to create the Rolling Stones. Some of that might have happened or may not have, and we could talk about that. But that's a part of it. To them, there wasn't any obvious future in front of them. And had they known what the future held, I think, as you point out, it might have been horrifying for them, because it's not a happy ending for most of the people involved in this. So beyond looking at endings, I wanted to start by the beginning. This book has an interesting, unusual genesis. It's very rarely the First Amendment lawyers who write the books about the beats, but this is, and I think it's one of the great strengths you bring to your book. So talk about how this got started.
Well, David Skover and I didn't intend to write a book about Lenny Bruce, though we did. We didn't intend to petition Governor Pataki to posthumously pardon him, and we did. And we didn't expect Pataki would do it, and he did. So right after we finished the Lenny Bruce book in 2002, a book called The Trials of Lenny Bruce, which we thought, we could tell the biography of Lenny Bruce through the lens of the First Amendment. And one of my colleagues here, Chris Finan, does precisely that sort of thing in his own writings. But when we just finished the Lenny Bruce book, Al Bendick, who was one of the key lawyers in the Howell case, the 1957 case, and he'd worked with us on the Lenny Bruce book because he was also Lenny Bruce's lawyer. He said, if you guys ever want to do another book, I was also, not only was I Lenny Bruce's lawyer, but I was one of the lawyers for Lawrence Ferlinghetti in the 1957 Howell trial, and I've got the trial transcripts and the court proceedings, and I've got everything. And he said, not only that, but the same judge that was Lenny Bruce's judge was the judge in the Howell trial in 1947. And we thought, well, how cool is that? And so, what did we know about Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg? Well, David's an opera singer. I mean, opera singers tend not to, this is a generalization, maybe untrue, but I tend not to read Jack Kerouac. Maybe they do, I don't know, but I know David hadn't, and so we...
It's a marvelous scene from On the Road when they go to the Colorado Opera.
Okay. I said corrected. There you go. That the Kerouac people know opera, but that the opera people know Kerouac, I don't know, but who knows? But in any event, so we first planned to write about the Howell trial. We signed a contract with Source Books that had published our Lenny Bruce book. They gave us a nice advance, and then something happened. It became apparent to us, the more we read and studied Howell, that Howell wasn't just some kind of jumble of words. It wasn't just some kind of esoteric thing that, made sense to people who had that mindset. That, in a sense, Howell was a biography. It was also an autobiography, of Allen Ginsberg and all these people that had come into his life. Naomi, his mother, Neil Cassidy, Herbert Huncke, just a whole array of people. And then we realized we really couldn't tell the Howell story unless we told the backstory, of all of these people who were involved in Howell. And so we went back and told our publisher, and he said, we're expanding the book. And they said, well, that's fine, but it's not fine for us. So there wasn't a meeting of the minds. We gave them back the advance. 8 years later, we published the book. This book has been finished for many years. I won't word you with all the things that happened, but so we started. I think, given our background as law professors, working with a lot of help with research assistants, although our eyes scrutinized everything they brought us, but we set out to read everything on Jack Kerouac, everything on Neal Cassady, everything on Bill Burroughs, everything on Carl Solomon, everything about the women involved in these things. I mean, everything, newspaper articles, I mean, everything. And we wanted to write it in narrative form, but with documentation. So the opening scenes of the killing of Lucien Carr, where Lucien Carr kills David Kammerer, a gay man, in 1944. I mean, considerable research went into writing that piece, drawing on diaries, newspaper articles, what have you. Anyway, to move the story, so when it was all done, we came back. There's that great line from "We shall not cease from exploration, and at the end of all exploring, we shall return to the place from where we began." So at the end of all this research, we come back to Lawrence Ferlinghetti in the 1957 trial. We interviewed him, and it was, the trial is the last part of the book, and here it was. It was another popular culture and free speech story, and we can talk more about the trial and its significance, but that's really how it came in to play. And we are now collecting, doing research on another First Amendment persona, a real awful rogue nightmare of a man. Probably nobody has posed a greater threat to the First Amendment. Chris and I may disagree on this, I don't know if we do, whether or not it was McCarthy, but for my money, Anthony Comstock was the worst of the worst, the man that brought obscenity to America in more ways than one. So we're thinking about doing a book about him now.
So you said the poem sent you back into the lives of the people that were in it. And I think one of the nice things you do in the book is take lines out of the poem and say who we're talking about in this. Because Ginsberg, of course, doesn't use names. He just talks about who did such and such, who did such and such. And it's easy to think of those as sort of iconic things, but they're not iconic things. They're Ginsberg's friends. And I wonder if you could, without decoding the entire poem, just parse a couple of those lines for us.
Well, Allen Ginsberg was, before he ever met Carl Solomon in an asylum in the early 50s, he knew a lot about madness. He knew it firsthand from his mother, Naomi. And there's some really chilling scenes in the book about Naomi, his mother. And in the poem, here's how it translates: who demanded sanity trials, accusing the radio of hypnotism, and were left with their insanity in their hands and a hung jury. Another person he talks about is David Kammerer. David Kammerer was a gay man from St. Louis. He knew Lucien Carr. Lucien Carr was the son of a very privileged family, would then move from St. Louis to New York, went to Columbia University. Very talented young man, but also a man with a very dark side. He used to go to parties and bite into wine glasses and chew it and then spit it out with blood, and stuck his head in an oven, urinated from windows, people walking by. He was really quite a character. He knew David Kammerer. David Kammerer was obviously gay. It didn't bother him. He even invited Kammerer to his class, and to one of his classes. But something strange happens in August of 1944, and they leave a bar after having been drinking. They go to the banks of the Hudson, where gay men usually hung out. And then all of a sudden, he stabs him several times in the chest, kills him. Kammerer didn't die immediately. He tied Kammerer's hands and then tried to drown him while he's gasping for breath and bleeding from the chest. As it turned out, Carr would be, because of his family and what have you, he would He received a very, very light sentence in what was called juvenile detention. But here's how that translates: the killing of David Cameron, who cut out each other's hearts on the banks of the Hudson. Life's a drama on a great stage, under the crimson street lamp of the moon. And, there's other characters, Neil Cassidy, Herbert Huncke. One last one, I'll just
I would ask you to do Bill Canastra, who's one of the people that we don't know so well.
Yeah.
Bill Canastra. We mentioned that a number of these people met untimely ends, and Bill Canastra's, I think, would be the most gruesome untimely one.
Yeah, Bill Canastra, Harvard graduate.
What's the life of the party?
Yeah, no, he...
Until he wasn't.
Yeah, he was also the death of the party. But Bill Canastra went to Harvard Law School, graduated, then comes to Columbia, and he gets in with this crowd, pretty unruly crowd. Not that Bill wasn't unruly in his own right, and he liked doing death-defying things. I mean, he really, because that caught people's attention. And so he had all sorts of antics. It's amazing that he lived as long as he did. One night he's on a train and people are partying and they're all pretty high. And Bill thinks it would be funny to stick his head out the window of the subway as it's traveling. And of course, mind you, he's pretty looped. There were pillars in the subway, as wide, twice the width of these pillars. And as the subway built up speed, he got trapped and he couldn't pull his battery back in. And as he was yelling and screaming, and his friends they were trying to pull him in, they couldn't. He was decapitated. And there's a line, a couple of lines in Howl about Bill Canastra. Of course, Canastra is barely dead for a couple of weeks when Jack Kerouac moves in with his girlfriend and then marries her. And then his buddies are singing a song about how terrible it is when a single guy gets married and, they lose their buddy. So it was part of Bill Canastra was part of all of that.
Breaking up the old gang, yes.
That's the song, yes, breaking up it's amazing. Can you imagine? I mean, here they're getting married, right? And the wife is right there, and all of them are singing a song called Breaking Up the Old Gang. And what breaks up the old gang? Marriage.
And you think that would be the prelude for a very long and happy marriage, but somehow it doesn't work out that way.
No. I don't think Jack Kerouac could have been happy with anybody, if truth be known.
It's my belief that his first wife, Edie Parker, remained a love of his life in strange and sometimes estranged ways.
Yeah, to the extent that he was capable of love, and I say it in a descriptive way, not in a pejorative sense. I mean, he was a man, as you know, with his demons.
Yeah, and his mother certainly would have been the true woman of his life to the end. These are such colorful lives, and you talked about some of the color in them, and they can sometimes overshadow their works. And the writer in the New York Review of Books, writing about the recent movie of On the Road and Joyce Johnson's biography of Kerouac, The Voice Is All, said that in fact that the lives they led and what they've left us of those is much more interesting than the literature that they've left us. And I wonder how you feel about that. They're so intertwined because the lives that they led are in their books. You don't have one without the other.
Right. My sense is that the contemporary attitude, particularly in English departments, which really weren't big on the beats in the early days, and the English departments are essentially, in many respects, as with law schools, those people who propagate conformity. I mean, editorial comment, you may have a different opinion, I welcome it. So that the beats are not seen as being significant in many English departments doesn't surprise me. That the significance of the Howell trial is virtually unheard of in law schools. More about that in a moment. Doesn't surprise me. The fish take the water for granted, right? but you get rid. The thing is, I think what happened is that they ushered in a whole mindset. All right, I mean, a whole new way of thinking about. I mean, they were outlaws in many respects. We're going to talk about this later, but it's still unlawful, illegal to read Howl on broadcast radio or television. Notice I say broadcast. I don't say cable or internet. I say broadcast. So it's still so. In some respects, even. These were outlaw works at their time. These were outlaw people, both literally and metaphorically at their time. And that somehow they still remain that way shouldn't be surprising for any variety of reasons. But I do think that, as I said, I just wrote a piece on the occasion of David Skover and I just wrote a piece on the occasion of Jack Kerouac's birthday. Had his liver held out. He would have been 91 this week on March 12th. But I was reminded of a line from a Bob Dylan song when I was writing this with David, and the line is, "To dance beneath the diamond sky with one hand waving free, silhouetted by the sea." I mean, that's the influence, if you will, of Kerouac, and that sort of thing, that kind of freedom, that kind of that ethos is very much alive, and we take it like the fish today as a given. It's our culture in many respects. I mean, the things that were taboo then are now taken as givens. They're not controversial or what have you. So that's my take on that. But I do think that, and we can get into this a bit, that the significance, legally speaking, of the 1957 Howl trial is very important for any variety of reasons. And
now, you mentioned that Kerouac would have been 91 this week. And, as I said before, that we do tend to look at these people through the prism of the 60s and forget that these were men and to somewhat a lesser extent, of the 30s and 40s, really shaped by these periods. And what's so revolutionary of them is that they produced what they produced out of the 30s and 40s. Again, and that's, I think Kerouac in particular looked back to the 30s as really a legitimate time, and the 40s and 50s as kind of being ersatz, and we'd lost our way. But
yeah, I agree. I mean, that vision of life that's portrayed On the Road, if you will, the ethos of Howl, that kind of nitty-gritty realism of Burroughs' Junkie or Naked Lunch. I mean, these things were just beyond the comprehension of America when it first came. I mean, it was just, it was like people had come here from another planet, and we have to kind of go back in time and see the world as they saw it, and that, to think that in the mid-1950s, all of these folks would gather at a garage that had been converted, into a center for poetry readings, and that somebody would read a poem like Howl. I mean, it well fits into America circa 1969, but America 1955, I mean, it was just a completely different consciousness. And I think in their literature and in their lives, though there were dark sides, there were killings, there were suicides, there were the unbelievable excesses. I mean, the money that bought that Hudson Hornet that Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg came from the life savings of Neal Cassidy's wife. He left his wife and their daughter virtually penniless when he bought that car, put the down payment on the car because they stiffed the owner for the rest of the money for that Hudson Hornet. So, I mean, it's all well to read about that and the excitement. But there was a lot of carnage, and I don't come necessarily to condemn it. I mean, I think freedom has its risk. You have to understand that, And so when we see the boys frolicking across the country, we don't see the women who have committed suicide. We don't see the mother and children who have been left penniless, you see. And so there was, on the one hand, the bravado, the excitement, the ethos, the free-spiritedness, but there was also some callous behavior that was objectionable then and should be objectionable today. my sense is you take your, we could talk about Lenny Bruce. I mean, you take your heroes as you find them, They're not flesh-colored Christs that glow in the dark, Bob Dylan line, by the way. Go ahead.
Well, you're quite clear about the ways in which they are not flesh-colored Christs that glow in the dark, or any colored Christs that glow in the dark in the book. And I'm wondering what sort of reaction you've gotten to that from people who really do put the Beats on a pedestal and don't want to hear that, in fact, it wasn't so much fun that they ran around doing these things, and that maybe they might have treated women in a little more enlightened manner.
I wouldn't say a little more, I'd say a lot more. You have to see some of the internal reviews that came years ago. We've saved them from this book, When Oxford University Press, with which I published other books. I mean, they were just rants. They were just, there was no way we could even respond to them. I mean, one of them, and I'm pretty sure I know who it was, and you know this person's name, although my editor never told me, but I came to realize later who it was. But, and I'm not mentioning this person's name. I'm going out of my way not to mention even this person's gender. But this person said, if you want a comic book, this is the book. This book should be illustrated with, and it just treats them as if they're a bunch of crazed rogues, drunks, drug addicts. And my sense is, one, did you read the book? And two, is there a single line in it that can be challenged? I mean, we went back, we did hundreds of revisions. And so there was, as we say at the end of the book, some of the keepers of the canon, I think, would prefer to see Jack et al., as the fun-loving, frolicking guys. And I'm more than willing to defend them in any variety of ways. But as I said, I come neither to condemn them nor to praise them simply, but just to tell their stories. And there's much about their stories that I think I admire.
And how do you make your peace with people that give writing that you admire and lived less than admirable lives?
How do you make peace with them? We go out as writers. You go out, as a writer, you cannot, particularly if you're doing biographies, you cannot fall in love with the person you're writing about, or you cannot, hate them. If you're going to be true, do any of us ever attain, quote, truth? No, but some of us come a little closer to the mark than others, and you just do your best. And there were times when I was writing about Lenny Bruce, I thought he was insanely funny, and the other times I think, oh my God, he's so cruel. I can't believe he's doing these things. Would I ever have him to my house for dinner? No way. So you do your best, and you kind of let the chips fall where they may. I believe in the First Amendment. If you don't like the book, criticize me, and we'll go from there.
Now, David Gates, the novelist David Gates, who wrote Jernigan and Preston Falls, who's one of my favorite writers, and I used to have the office next to me, and the week I started, he was compared to Camus by Michiko Kakutani in the Times. So he's written a while ago that the influence of the Beats now is everywhere in our lives. It's in our blue jeans, it's in the way we dress, it's in the way we talk, it's in that casualness, you can find it in any rock and roll lyric, but you can't find it, it's everywhere but in the novel. And that if you're applying for an MFA program now and you cite your influences, Jack Kerouac, that you might as well be citing O. Henry. And I wonder what you think about that.
Well, first of all, think of our culture. We live in a highly capitalist culture. Make of it what you will, all right? Does it have its advantages? Yes. Does it have its downside? Can you say Citizens United? For many of you, it does. So what has it done, right? Capitalism does what it does. It consumes, it transforms, it commercializes, it trivializes, Has that happened with, a lot of this stuff? Yeah. I have in my bag a keychain that says "On the Road." What's that? Would they be horrified what's happened to them? Probably in many respects, yes. Such is life. I think the question for people, my next book with David comes out on July 4th, called On Dissent, Its Meaning in America. I think, what a next generation of rebels, whether they young or old, have to think about is, how do you take issue with the Moloch, as Ginsberg would have put it, that demonic figure of capitalism, without being co-opted by it, That's quite a feat. So we saw what the Beats did in the 50s. What would something like that look like today? I don't know. But, I think that's inevitable, that sort of thing happening.
I look at these guys as working at the same time as the bebop jazz musicians who, suffered the same demons that the beat writers did. Heroin went through that generation of musicians. Madness, mental illness went through that generation of musicians as well.
The name Mania applies to almost all the characters in the book except John Leland Holmes and Lawrence Ferlinghetti, and he is still with us. I urge you to go to City Lights bookstore. I will be there in May with the man. And I will tell you something, they don't make them like Lawrence Ferlinghetti anymore. If I can, just a quick plug, First Amendment plug for one of my great, I really don't have any negative things to say about Lawrence Ferlinghetti, the truth be known. So imagine, the year is 1955, he hears Howl, he knows Ginsberg, he's determined to publish this poem. He's not letting the dirty words fly in his face. And by the way, mere dirty words, vulgar words, publishing them in those days could easily get you a ticket to jail, no problem there. So what does he do? He has the book published abroad and then brought into the United States. Customs agent sees it, right? Because the publisher had published a magazine called Miscellaneous Man, and that who knows what Miscellaneous Man is, but that magazine was deemed to be obscene, so they were on the lookout, So they seize copies of Howl, and the copies that were printed in Britain had asterisks for all the dirty words, what have you. So in all likelihood, although we're not certain of this, the copies that the customs agent seized were with asterisks, which is really a joke. I don't think anybody bothered to look at it. They may well have had some of the words left in. We just don't know. But in any event, the United States attorney decided, we're not going to prosecute this. This is not obscene, By the way, one other important thing happened. Contrary to what some people like Justice Scalia, and their gospel of originalism believe, it's not at all clear that obscenity was unlawful at the time of the founding. Basically, obscenity laws don't come to the United States until 1870. There's a couple of exceptions, but basically, it's not until the advent of Anthony Comstock. And from 1870 basically to 1957 is a very, very dark time for the First Amendment when it comes to freedom of expression and literature and what have you. And then in 1957, there's this incredible decision, Ross versus United States, that Justice Brennan writes. And it's the one thing it says is obscenity is not protected, but it says that, just because something's sexual expression doesn't mean it's obscene. So there was this kind of Janus Face decision that comes down in 1957. So while right after that decision comes down, just months after, Lawrence Ferlinghetti has this incident, and you see that the United States attorney refused to prosecute, right? But that didn't stop one of the local cops from bringing, they did a sting operation. So they send in these undercover guys to City Lights, right, to go and look at copies of Howl and buy Howl. Then they come back a couple of weeks later with warrants for the arrest for Ferlinghetti for publishing, and his clerk, Shigmararo, for selling the book. It's not even clear the clerk had even read the book, Howl or what have you. Maybe did, maybe didn't. We just don't know. And Ferlinghetti at the time was in Big Sur, but nonetheless, they're arrested and prosecuted. By the way, Ferlinghetti played it smart. He had anticipated that the agents, U.S. Customs agents, would seize Howl, so he had some off-print copies printed in the United States. So he was ready to go. And those did have the words in them without asterisks. So he was ready, and he'd also enlisted the ACLU to protect him. I mean, so, you know, the other guys might have been starry-eyed poets, but this guy really understood, you know, what had happened. So he's prosecuted for selling Howl. And why is Howl objectionable? Because it could corrupt young people. The young people might read it, all right? And so he's prosecuted, and what does he do? He writes an op-ed in the newspaper saying, bring it on. Bring it on. What's the worst that could happen to me? I could go to jail and read poetry. Life could be a lot worse than that, right? And then he goes to trial, right? And who's the judge? The judge is Clayton Horn, who's a born-again Christian, who a few months earlier had some women come before him in a case involving shoplifting, just kind of minor stuff. So what does he sentence them to? They have to go watch the 10 Commandments, write an essay, and then come back to court and read that essay in court. This is the judge that's going to preside over the Howl trial. They had waived the right to jury. And so when they go to trial, while the case is in court, what does Ferlinghetti do? He tells his clerks, fill the windows of City Lights bookstore with copies of Howl. Fill it with hundreds of copies of Howl. Bring it on. They could have shut this man down. They could have seized all of those copies. They could have sent him to jail. They don't make them like that anymore. And when it was all said and done, one of the most remarkable opinions ever written, unpublished. So no law student will find it in the official reports, because it was a trial judge. The guy did traffic cases, you know, nuisance cases. He didn't do First Amendment cases, but it's a phenomenal opinion. And guess what? Clayton Horn rules in favor of Howl. Meanwhile, Allen Ginsberg, the guy that wrote the poem, is off frolicking in Rome, and Lawrence Ferlinghetti and his clerk are both acquitted in a remarkable trial.
So, trial in 1957, the judge sends people home to watch the 10 Commandments. In a more recent obscenity trial involving the 2 Live crew that I was involved in,
Expert witness.
The defense, in order to show that community standards accepted similarly racy material, showed these videos that were available on the streets of Hollywood, Florida, or St. Petersburg, Florida, and I believe that it was quite a lot of stuff involving a vibrator. That was the day in court for the jury, was to watch these.
Unbelievable. You know,
so I promised I'd turn this over for questions.
One last thing, maybe like 90 seconds. In 2007, on the 50th anniversary of Howl, Lawrence Ferlinghetti and a number of us asked Pacifica if they would air Howl, if they would just, you know, say, okay, we're going to test this. Now, testing it meant a $325,000 fine for each word, for each radio station, for each time they said, you know, cocksucker. And though a number of people at Pacifica said, yes, let's do it, you know, if you will, Lawrence Ferlinghetti style, their lawyers at the end of the day said, we just can't take the chance. And so to this day, as in 1957, at least on broadcast and radio television, broadcast radio and broadcast television, Howl is still illegal.
All right, and now
your turn to Howl.
Over to you guys.
Here, I'm going to move.
Don't nobody leave.
I was just wondering, like, what you think the direct effect of, you know, Ginsberg and his crew to, say, like, Kenny Scarf and, who's the friend? Oh, Keith Haring, and all of them, like, doing their Dayglow parties, and eventually to, like, Studio 54, like, how was, you know, the movement that they started then in New York, like, do you think that really carried over to the 70s in the late 70s?
In terms of direct links, I can just speculate. As I said, I think it's in people's DNA. It wasn't coincidence that my son's first name is Dylan, right? It isn't a coincidence that a number of things that were important to me, passed down to him. It comes out in a variety of different ways, and God knows some of the hip-hop music he listens to tests my First Amendment credentials all the time. So I can't say other than it's just a mindset. It's just something that it becomes part of the culture. I think what the problem is that I think, particularly in a capitalistic culture, it so often co-opts that. It commercializes it. And so what's the difference between art and commercialism? Sometimes it's a hard call. When Ginsberg dies, some of and Kerouac dies, some of the snootiest of snooty, auctioneers are selling off all of this stuff for millions of dollars. If the boys are alive, they would have been there throwing all sorts of garbage at them, but such is life. So I don't know if that really answers your question, but I think it's more really part of something that gets into the air. And that's why I mentioned the analogy to the fish. The fish take the water for granted, and I think that's about all I can say.
But I would say one thing they shared is that they were both working in street language. The beats worked in the language of truckers and hobos and drifters and jazz musicians
and crazy people.
And Kenny Sharp and Keith Haring were working in the graffiti in the language of the street graffiti artists. They weren't. They had formal training in many of their cases.
No, I think that's a good point.
They were not working in formal traditions, in formal language, and I think that's something they share.
I think being certainly not old enough to be a geek, but just having sort of meeting these people incidentally through punk musicians that I went out with, staying at the bunker, and it influenced just sort of like a parental thing almost. I went out with someone who was in the Contortions, whose one friend worked for Allen Ginsberg and the other was James, who worked for William Burroughs. So that influence just, that's who they worked for and they worshipped and they respected.
Well, even from that era, if you listen to the music of the Ramones or Clash, it's, particularly when you hear a song like "I Fought the Law and the Law Won," that whole, as I said, ethos is there. This kind of comes back to John's point. You have to remember that in their time, they were literally and figuratively, because not all of them were, they were outlaws. They were code breakers, right? They really were. Being a code breaker means you offend people, right? You do things that upset people. There's all this kind of romantic thing. It's really cool, but the fact is, Lenny Bruce offended people. That's why they prosecuted him. That's why these people were. It took a while. It took a long time for, if you will, fame to catch up with them. And before that, there was just a lot of real hostile attitude, and really, it kind of, in a sense, it's a story about the First Amendment. Because if the First Amendment didn't protect things that offend us, why would we need it? If it just protected speech we agreed with, we wouldn't need it, right? And so it's there. That's kind of one of the things that I've always been attracted to, the whole, if you will, ethos of the First Amendment, and that is, it says to us, when things that offend you, come up, take a deep breath, right? When there's those attempts to say, that this Muslim cannot be within so many feet of where 9/11 took place, take a deep breath, When you hear that rap music that you could barely stand, take a deep breath. And, the fact is the Beats asked us to do that. And of course, Allen Ginsberg also said that when you read spontaneous prose, the breaths may be short and accented, but I think that's it. It's part of the culture.
I was once handcuffed in handcuffs belonging to Anya Phillips of the Contortions. So that's sort of my connection to that.
Frequently, you just mentioned First Amendment. You've mentioned this over and over and over and again. Why did you title the book Mania? Why didn't you title it First Amendment or something related
Well,
to that?
first of all, that might not sell.
Paul wouldn't be here.
Oh, okay.
No, but there was a wonderful line from Jack Kerouac about madness, and it's the one word that seemed to kind of capture all of them except for John Cleland Holmes and Lawrence Ferlinghetti. But it seemed, you know.
Well, I agree with that.
Yeah.
You're not saying maybe.
Well, but it's only the book ends with a First Amendment story, but it doesn't. Much of the story before that is about the lives of these men and to some extent women. Yes, ma'am.
What were the different mental illnesses they were diagnosed with for the ones that did have mental illness?
Well, I don't know that Herbert Huncke, who put everything and everybody conceivable and then some into his body, I don't know that Herbert Huncke was ever, quote unquote, diagnosed. But it's hard to imagine anybody by at least, quote unquote, normal standards who would be seen as more loathsome. I mean, the word that kept coming up from people who knew him was creepy. When he wasn't working the stalls selling heroin or doing tricks at Penn Station, he was, just the most bizarre of the bizarre things. Ginsberg really, he goes to an asylum basically to beat a rap for stolen goods. He kept the company. He thought it was cool to keep the company of a guy named Little Jack, who had been arrested 18 times and was stealing all sorts of stuff and keep storing it in his home. And his girlfriend Melody, a 6-foot hooker with a heroin problem, whose father was a judge. And when they're caught, he's busted with them. And basically they plead, and he goes to an asylum, which he thinks is very cool. He's very excited about that. And just to leave you with this, one of the things they had to cure him of was his homosexuality. And so they realize when he's all done with his therapy that he can't stay in New York. There's all these bad influences in New York. And so he has to really go someplace where he can be serious and cure himself of this homosexuality. So they all agree that the best place for him to go is San Francisco. With his mother, though, I mean, she was clinically insane, I think, in many respects. I mean, people like Bill Burroughs, one thing, just a quick story that kind of captures it, never diagnosed. The man is obviously gay. He marries a woman. He's the son of a very wealthy family, Harvard educated. He packs a gun wherever he goes. He's crazy about guns. His wife, Joan, they used to like to play the William Tell trick, where Joan would put a cocktail glass on her head and he'd take 20 paces away and shoot it off. And he did that 10 times, and, he's a perfect aim. And one time they're in Mexico and they're drinking heavily, and somebody says, "Hey, Bill, why don't you do the William Tell trick?" And so Joan says, "Okay." And she says, she puts a glass in her head. She says, "But I want to turn sideways." She just brought a new blouse, a Mexican blouse, and she didn't want to get blood on it in case he missed. And so here he is, she's drunk, he's drunk, and he shoots and kills her accidentally. And then they pay the police, and he leaves town. His lawyer gets the money in cash, goes out and buys a new Cadillac, drives the car off the lot. Some kids are driving. They scrape the car. He gets out of his car, shoots one of them. Wouldn't have been a big deal, except the kid was the nephew of the vice president, and so he's got to leave town. So why did we call the book Mania? I mean, Yeah, well, okay, all right. Yeah, there's all sorts of things, but no, absolutely. But Mania, at least in a general sense, captures it. Other questions?
Would you say that there are any beats of 2013, if you can say that at all? Probably not because it's 2013, but I don't know, just people who are pushing the boundaries in this era. I know that's a weird question.
I don't think there's an inside and an outside in the way there was in the 1950s or the 1940s or the 1930s. If you wanted to figure out what you're going to push against, what boundaries you're going to push, unless you're pushing into extremes of say, cruelty, body modification, I just don't think those have the same kind of meaning that they did.
Although maybe Chris Finan, who works in the First Amendment vineyards day in and day out, has some idea. Because, I mean, one of the ways you find out modern day rogues or outlaws is just look at who the government is coming after for expressing their speech or what have you. But none, if I started to put my First Amendment cap on, take off this City Lights one, I might think of some examples right now, and like I said, maybe Chris has some ideas, but...
I might hesitate to indulge my cannibal fantasies in public at the moment, but...
Well, certainly. No, that's a good example. That's a very good example. Julian Assange. That's an excellent example. Overtly political. One thing about the Beats is they weren't, at least at the time, they weren't political. I mean, not at least in the modern sense. Whereas I think Julian Assange definitely is political, and that has created. I mean, that really has tested, our First Amendment fiber, and I happen to believe that by and large, what Julian Assange did should be protected by the First Amendment.
Let's take
yes.
2 more questions.
Okay.
Which was more unusual period? The 40s and 50s, from which this was sort of a break back to a norm, or the 60s and 70s?
Which was a more unusual period? The 60s and 70s was a more unusual period. The 50s and 60s, I think one of the things that makes the characters, or the 40s and 50s, one of the things that makes the characters we're talking about so interesting was the extent to which they stood out from the environment that they produced them. Had they decided in 1967, you know what? We're just going to drive across the country and hitchhike, and then we'll go back the other way. Like, who gives a shit? Everyone's doing that,
I sometimes agree with Susan Sontag, who said that the 60s ended with the Charles Manson murders. As someone who was at Altamont for the Rolling Stones concert, it may have ended at Altamont, but, that's where, whatever, all of the beauty, if you will, of the counterculture seemed to take a very sharp turn with the advent of those criminal acts.
How the ripples from it are distributed everywhere today. Statement was made earlier that looking back towards the 30s, that had been seen as more authentic time, and followed by the I guess what I was attempting to ask was, are other eras aside from the 60s, 50s and 60s, are the close offenses mostly technical?
Well, just in brief, I will say this, and as any generalization, it's subject to critical response. But the 60s, the Warren Court aberrations. By and large, America does not move along those lines, and at least in law, we see all sorts of responses to the whole, if you will, freedom conception of American law that the Warren Court brought us. Just a quick note on that. Who would have thought, at the height of the Warren Court, the court that brought us Brown versus Board, who would have thought that the day would ever come when somebody challenged the Civil Rights Act, its voting rights provision, as unconstitutional? Who could have ever imagined that? And yet, that is before the court right now. They will probably declare the voting rights, or actual portion of it, unconstitutional. So I think it's important to understand that the 60s, both in terms of the culture, the music, everything, and also the law of the 60s, the Warren Court, those tend to be aberrations.
Sorry, this is a bit of a less serious question. You talked obviously a little bit about the kind of co-opting of the beats into mainstream culture and film and cinema and stuff like that. Is there any particular appearance of the beats in film that you think has kind of nailed it?
Well, John
got
has
it
some
right?
attitudes about some comments. I slipped, John. I'm sorry. About the recent movie On the Road, John.
Well, I don't know. I still remain a little bit baffled by On the Road. Did people see the movie On the Road? Anyone see it? Anyone like it? You liked it. You know, I sort of came away from that movie thinking that, gosh, this is just unfilmable now. The thing that I liked least about it was Kerouac's language in the movie, because it felt like the movie didn't believe in that language and didn't kind of believe in the Neil Cassidy figure in the way that the book did, and the book sort of takes you along on the strength of its bullshit, and I think that the narrator of the book is smarter than that, and he knows that Dean is kind of full of shit, but he's willing to go along with it, and that was just so much harder to do in the course of a movie where you're watching the Dean character with your own eyes, and you say, how could anyone follow this guy? You know, he's great looking and all, but come on, this is ridiculous.
And then
I think it's hard. You know, I think it's very hard to do. You know, I'm sort of a sucker for. I used to read any book that said, you know, it moves with the sinuous grace of a saxophone solo. Anything that said that in the blurb, like, oh, I'm picking this up and reading it. And so I'm also a sucker for those like 50s black and white bongo beat exploitation movies.
There's a movie coming out called Kill Your Darlings about the killing of David Cameron, which this book opens. We'll see how they do with that. But on that note, let me just say again a big thank you to the folks here at the Strand. And whether or not you buy Mania or whatever, it is important to support our independent bookstores, including this one. And that's also, in a sense, you support the First Amendment by doing that. And so I strongly urge you to do that. And if any of you have copies of Mania and I can inscribe it and you'd like to, I'd be happy to do it. And thank you for having us.
Thank you. Thanks very much.